The committee will come to order. The movement of personal communications to mobile services is dramatic and accelerating. Just this week, it was announced that for the first time, the number of homes having only a cell phone and no landline service now exceeds the number of homes having only a landline and no cellular service. Daily, new, attractive, and useful applications are coming to wireless services, and data rates continue to increase, ensuring that consumers can obtain faster access to mobile applications. Today, the subcommittee is beginning its examination of possible ways in which federal telecommunications policy may be adjusted in light of these developments, with the goal of enhancing the consumer experience and facilitating the future growth of mobile services. Our goal is to develop on a bipartisan basis legislation that will make timely needed policy changes respecting mobile services, and as we construct the measure, we intend to consult with both consumer representatives and cellular telephone companies. This morning, we begin that process by surveying possible areas in which policy changes may be needed. Today, most Americans can choose among wireless service providers that offer a truly nationwide service. It's not uncommon for people to live in one state, work in another state, and travel to many other states, all while using their cellular telephones. These consumers expect and deserve the same useful features and quality of service to be provided no matter where in our nation they may be using mobile services. Today, state governments have authority over consumer protection for wireless services, including such matters as customer billing information and practices. With a highly mobile nation using an inherently mobile service with a truly national footprint, I think it's hard to argue that for millions of mobile users, one state's consumer protection standards are particularly relevant to that user to the exclusion of others. The mobile industry presents a compelling example where a uniform national set of consumer protection standards would be more relevant to today's patterns of living, work, and travel. In exchange for meaningful national standards, the states would be preempted from standard setting, but as a practical matter should have a role in dispute resolution and standard enforcement. Another clear need is for the identification of additional spectrum that can be made available in the future for commercial wireless services. As more people use wireless devices and as advanced applications require ever higher data rates, over time additional spectrum will be needed in order to accommodate projected growth. Our legislation should direct that NTIA undertake a survey of possible new spectrum that could be auctioned in the future for that future growth. Other possible subjects of interest may include modifications to the rules relating to cellular tower siting, particularly where the application is to place transmitters on existing structures that already have transmitters attached. We should also examine whether the rules relating to roaming agreements should include data as well as voice services, which are covered by roaming agreement requirements presently. We should examine whether policy adjustments are needed to assure the adequate availability of backhaul in order to accommodate the growing volume of cellular traffic, and whether any policy adjustment is appropriate to assure that the newest handsets are available to a wider group of cellular providers. And one relevant question would be whether a wider use of the requirements that the Commission imposed last year on the auction of the C block could be a creative and perhaps helpful way of addressing that need. The testimony of today's witnesses on these and other legislative avenues we may consider pursuing will be very welcome, and I want to say thank you to our witnesses for taking part in our discussion this morning. Members will note the presence at the table of a variety of consumer representatives and also cellular telephone companies. Perhaps members have noted the absence of the two largest cellular telephone providers, AT&T and Verizon, from our conversation today. I want to note that invitations were extended to both of those carriers. Both wanted to attend, but the witnesses who they wanted to testify were not available because of other previously scheduled company events that required those witnesses' attendance. And both companies have been invited to submit their comments for this record, and I do anticipate their being a part of the record of today's hearing accordingly, and also being a part of any future conversations that we have on the subject of structuring provisions for legislation addressing mobile services. At this time, I'm pleased to recognize the ranking Republican member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns, for his opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. As you pointed out, the wireless industry has become one of the fastest growing and most competitive sectors of the United States economy because Congress has allowed consumers to rule the market. The way in which consumers use wireless services varies widely from person to person, and thus, obviously, we should resist imposing a one-size-fits-all regulation that would likely reduce choice and innovation. The industry has transformed from an all-analog duopoly to almost all-digital multi-carrier industry, where consumers can choose from 4 national providers and over 100 regional or local providers with a variety of plans and devices at a range of prices to meet the consumer's needs. Indeed, more than 99% of the consumers have 1 or more wireless carriers to choose from, while 90% have 4 or more choices. So obviously consumers are the big winners here. Between 1993 and 2008, the cost per minute has dropped to 4 cents from 44 cents, and the number of wireless subscribers increased from 11 million to 270 million, an increase of over 2,000%. Wireless technology will obviously transform our lives from health and education to banking and transportation. Imagine if an EMT at an accident site can send images of the scene to the ER so that trauma teams can be preparing themselves instantaneously. Or if teachers could stream live video from a zoo instead of reading about animals in an elementary school textbook. Applications in mobile banking could eventually mean that our wireless device will replace our wallet. And airlines are already experimenting with electronic boarding passes that are shipped directly to your handheld wireless device, saving time and saving money. We are only limited by our imagination and, of course, our temptation to regulate. The purpose of this hearing is to focus on a variety of issues, such as handset exclusivity, wireless net neutrality, special access, and maintaining a national regulatory framework. On the issue of handset exclusivity, some say it's anti-competitive and limits consumer choice. However, when the iPhone was introduced, consumers flocked to AT&T, challenging Verizon, T-Mobile, and Sprint to offer their own improved devices, services, and rate plans to remain competitive. On the other hand, I sometimes hear from constituents that they'd like to use their iPhone on any network that they wish. I hope our witnesses can address both sides of this very complicated issue. Wireless net neutrality is another important issue. I've already expressed concern that wireless net neutrality can jeopardize investments in innovation. This is especially true in the wireless context, since capacity constraints make the need for flexibility and traffic management all that more critical. Also, I hope our witnesses will address special access. In 1999, the FCC allowed limited deregulation of the special access market where providers could demonstrate evidence of competition. Some now argue that the market is no longer competitive and we should consider re-regulating. Both sides assert that the evidence proves their position. If that's the case, then perhaps we need to get all the data and resolve the issue once and for all. Innovation is occurring because carriers are looking for ways to drive usage on their networks in this competitive environment, not because of any government mandates. For example, without any government intervention, the application market is exploding. iPhone users have the choice of more than 35,000 apps, with more than 1 billion downloads in the 9 months that they have been live. It's important to point out that this occurred without a government mandate on AT&T. Therefore, instead of imposing new mandates, we should remove existing regulatory barriers, such as disparate, costly state regulation of service plans and fees. In 1993, we preempted state regulation of wireless rates and entry. That decision has fueled the tremendous growth. Since then, states have created a patchwork of regulations on service and billing practices that threaten their growth. So now is the time to create a national consumer protection framework. And finally, I'd also like to request that the committee start the process of identifying where the next allocation of spectrum for commercial use will come from. These inventory efforts generally have a long life between the start of the process and when the spectrum actually comes to market. Thus, the time to start is before America's carriers are spectrum constrained. Identifying spectrum will help ensure that the U.S. wireless market continues to be the world leader. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for holding the hearing, and I welcome our witnesses and look forward to their testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stearns. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell, Chairman Emeritus of the Full Energy and Commerce Committee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I commend you for holding today's hearing on competition in the wireless industry, a very important subject. Although the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, recognizes the United States as having one of the most competitive wireless industries in the industrialized world, the continued consolidation of that industry in this country behooves us to remain vigilant in ensuring robust wireless competition. Indeed, the fact that the two largest domestic carriers, AT&T and Verizon, control 60% of the market alone, naturally leads one to question the veracity of several conclusions reached in the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau January 16, 2009 report. Most notably, that consumers continue to reap significant benefits from competition in the commercial mobile radio services, CMRS, marketplace. As you are all aware, I've long maintained that greater competition is beneficial to consumers. Today's debate on issues related to handset availability, voice and data roaming, special access must not lose sight of their potential to increase competition in the marketplace. I welcome the opinions of witnesses assembled here today concerning these matters, but I'd like to offer a few observations of my own before engaging in that discussion. With regard to handset availability, I continue to question why a consumer is constrained to using a single particular handset, for example, an iPhone, on only one wireless provider's network. Although I understand this is due to contractual obligations, I wonder if a consumer would not benefit from greater choice in the networks available to his handset. I also wonder what it is that the Congress ought to do about this matter, and clearly this is a matter into which the committee should go today and at other times. Further, given the profusion of so-called smartphones in the marketplace, I feel it is imperative that we expand roaming requirements to include not only voice services, but also data services. And lastly, with regard to special access, I would reiterate my insistence from the 110th Congress that competitive carriers, CLECs, should make the same disclosure about their facilities as must incumbent local exchange carriers, the ILECs. I think this is a very important matter into which the committee should go. I look forward to a lively discussion of these matters and others this morning, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you not only for your courtesy, but for your vigor in addressing these questions. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Chairman Dingell. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, is recognized for 3 minutes. 2 minutes.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Talking about energy up here.
It's a good
Got distracted. But let me just highlight the issue on the competitive nature of the cell phone industry. It is highly competitive. And the simple example I will use is my 2-year contract expired in December. So in my local community, there's a development called Counsel Crossing, new. And part of that development is part of a strip of buildings. There's like 10 businesses. And as I researched, in 10 of those office sections, 3 are full-time national carriers selling their products. And a 4th one is in the Radio Shack. So what I was able to do was visit 4 competitive cell phone companies within less than 1/10 of a mile, and not only visit them and figure out the deal and their products and their services, but I was able to walk back and forth, comparing prices, comparing models, comparing options, until I found the provider and the equipment that not only I wanted to do at my price, but also that my 16-year-old son wanted. And nowhere else, in no other industry, in that short amount of space, not even in a big mall where you may have 2 wireless carriers, maybe 3 in the little subsections, but this is in Collinsville, Illinois. So I reject the premise that there is not a highly competitive nature to the cell phone industry. It's what makes this committee great, and it's what makes this industry so exciting for conservative capitalist Republicans, because you move too fast for us to regulate, and I'm going to stand to make sure that we don't.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shemkes. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this extremely important hearing today. Last year, when I chaired the subcommittee, we held a legislative hearing on a draft consumer protection and broadband bill with your support and with the support of many of our colleagues. That draft bill proposed a strong nationwide consumer protection policy for wireless subscribers. It had effective federal and state enforcement, the promotion of community broadband deployment, and a plan for federal agencies to assess their spectrum inventory and utilize frequencies using spectrum-efficient and cost-effective technologies. This last issue holds great promise for future innovation and job creation. And I congratulate you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership in this area. The wireless industry has suggested that Congress should preempt states from regulating the terms and conditions of wireless service, as it did over a decade ago with respect to the price for wireless services. Many states have initiated attempts to take action to provide consumer protection policies for their residents, particularly with respect to regulation aimed at wireless contract terms, early termination fees, privacy issues, and others. To the extent that wireless service is by its nature an interstate service, this hearing will provide an opportunity for us to explore whether further preemption is advisable, how consumer protection can be enhanced if regulatory treatment is nationalized, and how best to ensure rigorous enforcement of consumer protection. Since the subcommittee's hearings last year, problems posed by the current marketplace and regulatory structure have persisted, with roaming arrangements among carriers, with a lack of devices available to smaller regional carriers, with respect to portability of devices to other carriers remaining limited or non-existent, with a lack of clarity and uniformity with respect to billing terms and conditions, and an inability for consumers to effectively compare plans, and many consumers sometimes feeling trapped after buying an expensive device or getting locked into long-term contracts with significant penalties for switching. This is a very important hearing. I thank you for your continuing leadership, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Markey, and you did excellent work on this general subject during the last Congress. We are using the legislative draft that you assembled, as the foundation for our consideration this year, and I want to thank you and commend you for that outstanding work. The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Booyer, is recognized for 2 minutes. The gentleman reserves his time and will have his time added to his question time for this panel. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing. In all of my years on this committee and this subcommittee, rather, I've always been concerned with the lack of diversity in competition in the telecommunications market. I have found the lack of diversity in the wireless marketplace to be particularly disturbing because the spectrum used by wireless companies is a public asset owned by all of the American people and not by just these companies. I continue to be dismayed over the fact that women and minority businesses have little, if any, presence in the wireless industry. Given that the market for advanced wireless services is rapidly growing and will likely soon displace traditional wireline telecommunications services, it is vital that we ensure diversity in the market now and not kick the can down the road not for another day. As such, Mr. Chairman, I hope that these fine witnesses who are gathered here can comment on this long-standing interest of mine. And I further hope that with a new administration, we will finally find some public commitment to ensuring that all Americans can partake in the multi-billion-dollar wireless industry. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rush. The gentleman from California, Mr. Radanovich, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and examining the competition in the wireless industry. I appreciate the effort on this. As co-chair of the Wireless Caucus with Mr. Inslee, I appreciate the opportunity to explore the ways we can work together to ensure that the wireless customers will have the most innovative, best quality services at competitive prices. One area I believe that is hindering effective competition is tower siting. The ability to deploy wireless systems and expand services, thereby increasing competition for customers, relies on the ability to construct and place towers and transmitters. Yet 3,300 wireless siting applications are pending before local jurisdictions awaiting a decision. Approximately 760 have been pending final action for more than a year, while 180 of those have been waiting for more than 3 years. The problem is that the Communications Act is very ambiguous about the time in which a decision on these applications has to be made, requiring only that it be done within a reasonable time frame. This potential for delaying action discourages investment and prevents consumers from receiving the full benefits that come from increased service and competition. I'm sympathetic to the demands on zoning authorities and must be given enough time to properly review these applications. However, this process must have an end to it so that carriers are not continually left wondering whether they will get an answer at all. I look forward to working with the interested parties and the committee towards resolution to this matter, and I'm also aware that there is an effort to have the FCC reset price caps for special access, and I do not believe that this is possible or should be possible until the FCC has all the relevant data on the full scope of high-capacity services. Nevertheless, I'm thrilled that this hearing is taking place and look forward to the testimony from the witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Radanovich. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, is recognized for 2 minutes. The gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen, Mr. Doyle has just returned and is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. Thanks for holding this hearing. Mr. Chairman, you know, some people who have my cell phone number are very interested in my car. I just want to say for the record, my car warranty is not about to expire. I'm not really happy that they call my cell phone, and I'm not happy that they keep calling me, even though I'm on a do not call list, and even though calling my cell phone is blatantly illegal. And even though I've tried to get on these companies' do not call list, they still keep calling me. So I just want to say, stop doing that. I hope the FTC and the FCC hunt each and every one of you down and make a lesson out of you by interrupting every one of your meals that you eat for the rest of your lives with a telemarketing call. Okay, I feel better now. Now, on to more happy topics. Since we last looked at the wireless industry, we've seen dramatically improved customer service. Consumers generally better understand the contracts they sign and the services that are available to them. That's not to say it's all perfect. In fact, many of us up here have had problems with our bill. And I do agree with those who say that text messages are still priced way above cost. For example, if you were to send enough text messages to fill this 1.5 megabyte floppy diskette at 20 cents a message, you'd have to pay over $2,000. And if you were to send enough text messages to equal the size of an MP3 song, that would cost almost $6,000. But I think most of the companies have improved. One example, Verizon Wireless has successfully sued several companies for illegal telemarketing and text message spam. I'm glad to see that the company and the FTC and the FCC are working on this problem. And I'm glad to see that most of the carriers have clearer bills and prorated contracts. Mr. Chairman, if you decide to move a national framework bill, I look forward to seeing that will give consumers across America peace of mind with a baseline of reliable consumer protections. Thanks for your patience, and I yield back my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Doyle. The gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this hearing as well. A lot's already been said about the positive competitive nature of the wireless marketplace. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put in the record a Consumer Reports story I found very interesting on this issue, dated January of 2009.
Without objection.
Which our colleagues may find of interest. I'm one of those. I'm one of those people that, has 3 cell phones, Mr. Chairman, one official, one personal, one campaign. And so I get experience on a lot of them. Fortunately, I've not been called about a car warranty yet. I suppose I shouldn't admit that, but I'm not going to give out the number either. But I know that this marketplace has changed dynamically and rapidly in a way that's very positive. As rates have come down, service has been expanded and options have increased. And so I look forward to seeing where we can help this very mature industry move forward and keep the competition going that drives down prices and makes these devices available. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Walden. The gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Boucher, and thank you and Ranking Member Stearns for holding this hearing to examine issues related to wireless competition in our country. The wireless industry has a tremendous impact on the U.S. economy and includes about 600 companies with combined annual revenue of over $110 billion. It's projected that by 2016, this revenue will increase to $427 billion annually. However, some argue that the industry is highly concentrated with 4 national wireless carriers earning about 85% of the industry revenue and 2 controlling 90% of special access. It's important to preserve competition within the wireless industry in order to ensure that consumers, especially in rural areas and places like the U.S. Virgin Islands that I represent, have access to reasonable rates and the best of services. Competitive local exchange carriers, such as the ones testifying today, rely heavily on the incumbents for services like special access, yet they're limited in options for service providers. This inevitably raises prices for the CLECs and makes it difficult for them to remain competitive. Mergers also can pose a significant threat to competition, especially if the conditions are not imposed and then implemented. The wireless industry is thriving and steadily growing at an enormous rate, but for some carriers it's still difficult or virtually impossible to compete in this industry. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on this issue and their recommendations on keeping the industry competitive, and I thank them for being here.
Thank you very much, Ms. Christensen. The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, has waived his opening statement and will have additional question time added. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to say that I noticed today the same stats that you apparently cited in your opening statement, that for the first time, there are more American families with wireless phones than with hardline phones. And we know that all families are really struggling. All American families are really struggling in these very tough economic times. They're looking for any savings that they can. in their household budget, and thanks to more competition, providing more spectrum, something that this committee did, lifting many of the burdensome regulations, the costs of families have gone down. And we can congratulate many in this room for seeing that happen. I would just say to Mr. Doyle, who has stepped away, maybe he's listening in the NA room, there is a provision in most contracts, at least with mine. I have 2 teenagers. There is such a provision as an unlimited text message section. I think it's about $4 a month. I would suggest that, as it saved me a lot of money after the first abuse of my son, Stephen. Thank you. Yield back my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Upton. The gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. I'm interested in today's hearing because of how dynamic the industry is. We've seen a tremendous transformation in the last decade or so. I'd like to see that competition continue and want to make sure that federal regulation isn't part of the problem, that it's part of the solution. Right now there does seem to be a consolidation going on in the industry, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say about what that is doing to the competition. In particular, does handset exclusivity or tower siting, or those issues that are part of the problem, or do we need to look at how those are being regulated right now? So with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McNerney. The ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I won't take that time. I'm going to submit my full statement for the record. I'm a 3 cell phone person. If you count BlackBerries in my immediate family, there's 7. We contributed to that $75 billion of revenue fairly substantially last year, and we enjoy it. I'm told that there are about 280 million cell phone customers, which is almost 1 per person. This is obviously an industry that is thriving. There is consolidation going on. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We have 2 market participants that each have, I think between them, the top 2 have about 60% of the market. The thing that I would bring to the committee's attention is this issue of states regulating terms and conditions. We did leave that, if you want to call it a loophole, or we left that open several years ago. I think this subcommittee would be wise to take a look at that and see if we do now need to set up a national regulatory framework for terms and conditions that might help continue the growth of the industry that's thriving. And with that, I'm glad we're having a hearing where we're not arguing over free allowances for CO2. So this is a good hearing, and I look forward to listening to our witnesses.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barton. We'll have a discussion later on that very
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm afraid of, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll waive my opening.
Thank you, Ms. Castor. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the panel of witnesses. Compared to much of the telecommunications industry, the wireless sector might look like it's wildly competitive. Most consumers actually have some degree of choice for service, unlike the broadband sector where 90% of Americans have 2 or fewer choices for service, or the wireline industry where the choices are largely non-existent. Wireless technologies are bridging some of these gaps and improving the competitive landscape, but there remain major choke points and anti-competitive practices that inhibit true competition and tilt the playing field steeply in favor of a pair of dominant carriers. I think my colleagues are aware of whom I speak, and I'm disappointed that Verizon and AT&T aren't here today. I hope that they'll decide to come in the future. After all, the top 3 wireless firms control nearly 80% of the wireless phone business in America. That's a real stronghold. A particular concern I have in the wireless industry is the market for special access services. Special access is the high-speed middle mile between the internet backbone for wireless phone and data towers, hospitals, banks, retailers, and other medium and large businesses. For wireless carriers, the cost of special access carriage is up to 1/3 of the expense of running a wireless tower. Special access is a significant choke point in the telecommunication system, since Verizon and AT&T control 80 to 90% of the special access market nationwide. In 1999, the FCC moved to deregulate special access, and not surprisingly, with such limited competition, prices have skyrocketed. Recent data indicates that for the 3 large regional bell companies, the rates of return on special access range from 15 to 38%. In 2005, the FCC initiated a proceeding to review special access rates, and 4 years later, the Commission's review is still pending. In November 2006, the GAO issued a report entitled FCC, right here, FCC needs to improve its ability to monitor and determine the extent of competition in dedicated access services. I think Chairman Martin must have missed that one. So I'm pleased that the Senate has finally scheduled the hearings to confirm a new chairman of the FCC. I hope the Commission, and I would urge them to pursue this proceeding aggressively and determine where there's actual competition and fair pricing in this important market. I also want to mention one other important competitive issue in the wireless industry: access to spectrum. In the most recent major auction of wireless spectrum, the 700 megahertz auction last year, 84% of the winning bids went to Verizon and AT&T. Again, it's difficult to see how the wireless sector can be competitive when 2 players dominate in so many respects. There are new entrants trying to break up this dominance, and some of them happily are on the panel today. We look forward to hearing from you. I think another avenue for a disruptive new entrant would be the auction of the AWS-3 spectrum, now lying fallow. So again, I hope the FCC proceeds on this matter. It's been pending for over 2 years, and I hope it'll finally be taken up. So welcome to all of you. I look forward to hearing your testimony, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Eshoo. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Shadig, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, other than to thank you for holding this hearing and to thank our witnesses, I'll waive my opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shadig. The gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Stearns, ranking member, and thank you to the witnesses. You know, Vermont is a very rural state and has had some experience trying to deal with some of the issues that we're going to be dealing with as a committee: tower siting, roaming, lack of competition. And most Vermonters are actually pretty pleased with the wireless service that they get, but it's incredibly critical to our economy to have wireless service everywhere. And the Vermont legislature has passed legislation calling on doing whatever it is we can do to extend wireless throughout the state. And our goal is to achieve 90% of coverage. Some of us think it ought to be 100%, and we're in the process of installing tower sites and using some of our barn and silos to actually help us along the way. We're working on streamlining the permitting process for new telecommunication towers and antenna to facilitate reaching our goals. But there are many issues remaining. The cost of wireless backhaul is obviously a big one. Roaming rates are an enormous problem for many of our users. Vermont has not been able to attract the interest of some of these large national carriers to serve some of our most rural areas. So they're kind of skimming the good economic opportunities and ignoring where we need a lot of help. The progress in my state has been largely a result of local efforts. So we would have some significant concern about this balance between a national plan and freezing out the ability of states to actually play a very aggressive role in trying to extend the benefits of wireless to their citizens. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for convening this subcommittee hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Welch. Mr. Inslee was here earlier. I don't see him now, and unless he's planning to appear momentarily, we're going to turn to our first panel of witnesses. We will turn to our first panel of witnesses, and I want to welcome the attendants of each here this morning. I'll say a brief word of introduction. Mr. Paul Schieber is Vice President for Access and Roaming for Sprint. Mr. Robert Irving is Senior Vice President and General Counsel for Leap Wireless. Mr. Victor Meena is President of Cellular South. Mr. Ravi Potharlanka is Chief Operating Officer for FiberTower. Mr. Chris Murray is Senior Counsel for Consumers Union. And Dr. George Ford is Chief Economist of the Phoenix Center. We welcome each of our witnesses this morning and thank you for sharing your views with us. Without objection, your prepared written statement will be made a part of our record, and we would now welcome your oral summaries and ask that you keep those summaries to approximately 5 minutes so that we have ample time for questions. Mr. Schieber, we'll be happy to begin with you. And if you would turn your microphone on, we'll hear you better. And you do need to turn your microphone on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Boucher, Congressman Stearns, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Paul Schieber, Vice President, Access and Roaming at Sprint Nextel Corporation. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today about competition in the wireless industry in the United States. For years, Sprint has been a leader in the development and deployment of data services, including a 3G mobile broadband platform throughout most of its network, as well as the development of 4G technology. In recent years, Sprint has spent billions of dollars to deploy its 3G EVDO network, improve its performance capabilities, and increase the array of advanced services that are available to consumers through its mobile broadband platform. Through our investment in Clearwire, we are also committed to maintaining our leadership role in making 4G broadband services widely available to U.S. consumers and businesses. These mobile broadband services will undoubtedly fuel significant economic development and job growth. Unfortunately, there continue to be several impediments to Sprint and other wireless and wireline provider efforts to make broadband services ubiquitously accessible and reasonably priced for all Americans. In Sprint's view, the biggest of these impediments is the failed special access market. But I want the members of the subcommittee to know that Sprint is also supportive of efforts to reform the nation's cell siting laws. We need laws which make it easier for wireless carriers to co-locate facilities and to ensure timely approval of cell site construction. I focus my testimony on special access reform, however, because Sprint believes that should be a top priority of the FCC and this subcommittee. Special access is the lifeblood of the telecommunications industry. It touches virtually every communications product and is a critical part of the services consumers use every day. When consumers make wireless calls, access the internet, send emails, swipe their credit cards at stores, or use automated teller machines, they're using services that rely on special access. The importance of middle mile facilities to the wider deployment of broadband was underscored by Susan Crawford, a member of President Obama's National Economic Council, who recently stated, and I quote, "Investments in backhaul or middle mile networks, particularly in rural communities, will likely be particularly useful. When Sprint and other carriers provide mobile broadband services, we need other providers to link together into a seamless network our facilities. In the simplest configuration, a broadband provider must interconnect 3 segments of an end-to-end service: a local network, middle mile facilities, and a backbone network. In Sprint's case, its local wireless broadband facilities connect a caller or a laptop user to a nearby cell site. Sprint then needs middle mile transmission circuits to transport the customer's traffic from the Sprint cell site to a mobile telephone switching office, and from there to Sprint's internet backbone network. As has been repeatedly demonstrated by Sprint and other wireless and wireline broadband service providers, as well as by reports issued by the GAO and the National Regulatory Research Institute, we are overwhelmingly dependent on special access facilities provided by incumbent LECs. Despite the central role of special access in mobile and fixed broadband deployment and the benefits that would come from robust competition, incumbents control 91.7% of the special access market, and 2 dominant carriers, AT&T, and Verizon alone receive 81% of all special access revenues nationwide, generating a rate of return of up to 138% on these revenues in the case of AT&T. This is obviously not a competitive market. The monthly payments for middle-mile special access Sprint incurs in its wireless business represents about 1/3 of the cost of operating a cell site. In most cases, Sprint simply has no competitive alternatives to the incumbent LEC for these facilities. Today, Sprint buys access from vendors other than the LEC at only 4% of its cell sites. The excessive prices that incumbent LECs charge for these middle-mile connections harm consumers, cost us jobs, and divert needed resources from Sprint's broadband network and services. Fortunately, the FCC has the legal authority and the evidentiary record to fix the problem and spur broadband deployment. Reform of special access will promote mobile and fixed broadband growth by freeing resources that can be used to invest in new facilities, create new jobs, and contribute to the nation's economic recovery. I respectfully ask this subcommittee to urge the FCC to act now. The special access rulemaking, now pending more than 6 years, must be completed now to rein in anti-competitive special access prices and practices by incumbent LECs, allowing Sprint and other competitive providers to accelerate the deployment of mobile and fixed broadband. Stimulating broadband deployment in this way will generate economic growth and expand consumer access to broadband communications, and it will do so without spending a dime of taxpayers' money. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schieber. Mr. Irving.
Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns.
And if you could pull that microphone a bit closer, it would be helpful to us. Thank you.
And members of the subcommittee. Thank you for allowing me to testify today on behalf of Leap Wireless and its subsidiary Cricket Communications. I would also like to thank you and the Congress for your leadership in appropriating stimulus funds to expand broadband services and to improve access to broadband by public safety agencies. While you are addressing many important issues today, I would like to offer Cricket's perspective on one of them: the importance of automatic voice and data roaming to ensure effective competition in the wireless industry. First, I would like to note for you where Cricket fits in the industry and briefly explain why small and mid-sized carriers like Cricket promote innovation and competition. Cricket and its joint venture partners have built digital networks covering almost 84 million individuals in 32 states, and we're continuing to grow steadily. In fact, we will launch service in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore in the next several months. Cricket services are specifically tailored to bring wireless communication to consumers who have been left behind by other providers. We offer consumers unlimited voice and data wireless services for a flat monthly rate, with no fixed-term contracts, no credit check, and no early termination fees. We also recently introduced an affordable wireless broadband product at $35 to $40 per month for unlimited service. Our customer base reflects our commitment to the underserved. A majority of our customers are Hispanics, African Americans, and other minorities, and our customers tend to be younger and less affluent than our competitors' customers. We recently partnered with the nonprofit group One Economy to provide very low-income families in Portland, Oregon with computers, modems, and free Cricket wireless broadband for 2 years. This pilot program has been tremendously successful in promoting broadband access and in increasing the internet savvy of program participants. One participant reported to us that he's now enrolled in an online English class. Another said that she now uses emails to apply for jobs. Cricket hopes to expand this program to reach other very low-income families who can benefit from affordable broadband service. Our growth and our commitment to a diverse customer base illustrate the type of competition that Congress and the FCC have tried to promote. And our success demonstrates that innovative pro-consumer benefits that small and mid-sized carriers bring to the wireless marketplace. We show that being pro-consumer can be good for business. We discipline prices in every market that we enter, and our presence prompts other carriers to offer a wide range of choices, including flat-rate, unlimited usage plans like the plans we pioneered. In recent years, we have been concerned with the increasing consolidation of spectrum and market share into the hands of the nation's largest carriers, and the consequence of this trend for small and mid-sized carriers, and more importantly, for consumers. Cricket and other small, rural, and regional carriers increasingly face anti-competitive business practices, such as the largest carrier's refusal to provide wholesale roaming on reasonable, non-discriminatory rates and terms. Automatic roaming agreements play a critical role in the wireless industry. They plug coverage holes that exist in every carrier's network. Reliable service is not simply a marketing tool. Whether we're trying to get emergency text message alerts, seek help if we have car trouble, or contact family members in the wake of a hurricane or terrorist attack, consumers should not suffer dropped calls when they travel away from home. Unfortunately, the nation's largest carriers have institutionalized policies of charging very high wholesale rates or denying roaming services altogether to other carriers' customers in areas where the requesting customer can theoretically provide service. These behaviors weaken emerging competitors' service offerings, in spite of the fact that the largest carriers themselves have relied on roaming agreements for over 30 years to expand their own networks and to improve service. These anti-competitive practices harm all consumers by reducing competition, but they disproportionately burden disadvantaged and rural populations, many of whom cannot afford or qualify for wireless service provided by the nation's largest carriers. In my written testimony, I have described several proceedings in which the FCC has an opportunity to improve its current policies with regard to automatic roaming. I urge Congress to monitor these proceedings closely, to encourage the FCC to adopt pro-consumer, pro-competitive approach to roaming, and if necessary, to consider legislative solutions that ensure all consumers have access to affordable, nationwide wireless coverage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Irving. Mr. Meena.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for allowing this opportunity to testify before you today. I've been in the wireless industry for over 20 years with Cellular South, the nation's largest privately held wireless carrier serving all of Mississippi and 4 other southeastern states. In my years in the wireless industry, I've seen the duopolistic world of the early cellular licenses when there were 2 and only 2 carriers in each market. The rise in wireless competition as a result of the later spectrum auctions and the growth and innovation throughout the industry as a result of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. However, today I'm convinced that unless things change quickly, the industry is coming full circle and progressing, or rather regressing, into a duopoly once again. Today, AT&T Wireless and Verizon Wireless have almost 65% of the national market. Over 90% of the wireless market is in the hands of those 2 plus Sprint and T-Mobile. This should come as no surprise after the parade of acquisitions over the past several years. One of the effects of the market concentration is that the largest carriers now use their market power to demand and receive long-term exclusive agreements with device manufacturers for the latest and greatest technological handsets. Exclusivity agreements prevent other carriers from acquiring these devices and are particularly harmful to wireless consumers. The practice has worked so well for the large carriers that they are now using the same formula for the emerging netbook market as well. What would happen if merchants sold computers that only worked with one internet service provider? For example, imagine a world in which Macintosh computers only worked on AT&T DSL. That, of course, is exactly the world we live in with the iPhone and Apple's exclusivity agreement with AT&T Wireless. If a consumer wants that handheld computer, he or she must subscribe to that service through AT&T. This battle among the industry titans has left consumers as collateral damage because device manufacturers are prohibited from offering cutting-edge devices to the smaller carriers who many times serve rural areas. Even in areas that are served by the largest carriers, consumers are not free to choose the latest devices without being forced into accepting services from a specific carrier. If you live in New York City and want an iPhone, then you're obligated to be an AT&T Wireless customer. If you live in Washington, D.C. and want a BlackBerry Storm, then you'll be a Verizon Wireless customer whether you want to or not. The situation with exclusivity agreements is bad and only getting worse. Cellular South and customers like us have tried to find solutions to this problem without resorting to help from policymakers. We have attempted several solutions within the industry, including direct talks with device manufacturers, industry association working groups, and consolidating purchasing power through buying groups. But all these efforts have been fruitless. Without legislation from Congress or action from the FCC, there will be no solution to this issue. On the topic of roaming, far and away the most important issue is that of automatic roaming for data services, specifically roaming for broadband. When I began in this industry, roaming agreements could be negotiated in a matter of an afternoon and usually finalized within a week. Today, the largest carriers use their market power to dictate unreasonable roaming terms, or they refuse data roaming agreements altogether. 700 megahertz licensees not named AT&T or Verizon cannot build out their next generation networks without high-speed data roaming agreements. This is increasingly important as carriers deploy new data technologies that provide services anywhere, anytime, such as telemedicine applications, and voice services over Internet Protocol, somewhat better known as VoIP. I ask you, is VoIP voice roaming or is it data roaming? Better yet, why should it matter? We are at a critical period in the wireless industry. Although the wireless industry may no longer be in its infancy, it is no more mature than an awkward adolescent. There is much innovating left to be done. There are many people of all socioeconomic backgrounds and geographic locales who have yet to benefit fully from the wireless experience. Before it is too late, Congress must step in and put an end to the largest carriers' anti-competitive stranglehold on devices, as well as ensure full roaming access. The future of free markets in our industry and the delivery of wireless broadband services to rural America depends on it. A light regulatory touch today will prevent the re-emerging duopoly in which two companies control all the customers, all the best devices, all the prime spectrum, and become too big to fail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meena. Mr. Potharlanka.
Good morning, Chairman Barcher, Ranking Member Stearns, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity today to testify about the importance of middle and last mile backhaul services in the context of competition in the wireless industry. My name is Ravi Potharlanka, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of FiberTower Corporation. Formed in 2000, FiberTower is the nation's leading alternative carrier for middle and last mile backhaul. FiberTower operates hybrid fiber microwave networks in 13 U.S. markets. The top 8 mobile carriers and the government are amongst our largest customers. We have national scope 24 gigahertz and 38 gigahertz spectrum licenses and access to over 100,000 towers. We also offer fixed wireless services across the nation. We've been offering backhaul services for the last 6 years and are in a position to offer a unique perspective. Let me explain. Backhaul connects last mile end users, including those that serve first responders, homeland security, municipal buildings, medical facilities, schools, and libraries, to the internet and to other network switching centers. Absent backhaul infrastructure, broadband networks cannot operate. Also, backhaul and transport infrastructure must be built before end users can fully realize the benefits of broadband. In fact, backhaul is often considered the Achilles heel to achieving broadband connectivity. This lack of development in unserved and underserved areas has inhibited the growth of broadband services. Our modular network is relatively inexpensive to deploy when compared to fiber and can often be up and running in a matter of days. I want to applaud the subcommittee on its leadership in producing the broadband stimulus programs. The subcommittee and the committee identified middle mile and last mile backhaul appropriately as a critical piece in achieving broadband expansion. We see the access to this capital as a unique opportunity to catalyze the expansion. For example, we could build in the western half of Virginia backhaul networks similar to those that have been built elsewhere. In just months, we could get people working throughout the unserved and underserved communities and make broadband accessible. This will create long-term jobs while permanently enhancing the economy. This model can most definitely be deployed in other areas of the nation. I would now like to draw your attention to 4 important matters. First, mapping of unserved and underserved areas must include middle and last mile backhaul. the FCC, NTIA, and RUS should consider an area without adequate backhaul or transport coverage as underserved, even if such an area has an end-user broadband service provider. An area without backhaul is unable to support multiple broadband networks that drive the economy. Second, ensure that multiple-use backhaul platforms, which are called muni-frames, are accessible to all end users identified in the legislation. Doing this truly brings broadband to the area while greatly reducing costs. It is important to ensure that all parties have the ability to access these platforms in a non-discriminatory manner. Third, reinforce the existing federal preemptions or burdensome zoning and permitting restrictions for fixed wireless antenna placements. Restrictions that impair the installation of small antennas for fixed wireless are not permitted under a very specific FCC ruling. Zoning and permitting requirements often add substantial delays and costs to deployments. Fourth, make a limited number of the numerous vacant TV whitespace channels available for point-to-point licensing. The recently completed FCC TV whitespaces order is the first step in unleashing broadband deployments to unserved and underserved areas. The lack of backhaul and transport services is particularly problematic in rural areas where great costs and great distances slow or prevent connections to switch locations of the internet. However, whitespace channels make long-range propagation possible, thereby reducing the number of required towers to reach the same distance. There is no member of this Congress more committed than you, Mr. Chairman, to bringing high-speed broadband to America. I submit to you today that should FCC grant point-to-point licensed use for limited number of TV whitespace channels, it could stimulate rural broadband. This proposal involves a small number of numerous vacant rural channels and only in a fashion that protects incumbents and promotes plentiful and healthy sustained growth for unlicensed devices. A 100-mile connection using white spaces would typically cost less than $200,000 to deploy, while the same connection using some proposed bands like in 6 or 3.65 gigahertz spectrum would likely cost more than $3 million, almost 15 times as much. Similarly, a new trenched fiber build in the same distance would normally cost at least 20 or 30 times more expensive and be slow to deploy. In conclusion, making a limited number of TV whitespace channels available for before the initial stimulus grant filing deadlines is very critical. Finally, we strongly recommend the following: continued reinforcement of FCC rules that preempt burdensome zoning and permitting restrictions for small fixed wireless antennas, comprehensive mapping of middle mile and last mile backhaul, and an express eligibility for backhaul and transport projects under the BTOP and RUS programs. This now concludes my oral testimony, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Potharlanka. Mr. Murray.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you once again on behalf of consumers and on behalf of Consumers Union, the publisher of Consumer Reports magazine. I'm pleased to report that this year the satisfaction of consumers in the cell phone industry does seem to be headed upwards. You may remember last year it was bottom of the barrel. It was 18th out of 20 services that we rate. But this year it seems to be moving closer to average, and we're happy about that. Fewer consumers are complaining about automatic contract extension, and fewer consumers are complaining about early termination penalties as vociferously, although we still believe that because these fees are starting from a very high level, we agree with state courts they're finding they may be illegal. So we think that scrutiny is warranted. But we have a new top concern of consumers this year, and that is the high price of cell phone service. And you may recall the last time I was here, I said that U.S. consumers pay more than consumers around the world for cell phone service. Now, on a per-minute basis, as the industry is quick to note, because U.S. consumers talk an awful lot, we pay a little bit less. But if you look at just the dollars, the amount of money that people spend every year, U.S. consumers spend more on cell phone service than in any other industrialized nation. We also see that SMS text revenues are up for the carriers over 150% per texting subscriber. And that's not overall over the whole network. That's just for the people who text. It's up 150% over the last 4 years. We see this year the rage is consumer overcharges for data plans. And we see one subscriber, I had an account of somebody who bought a netbook and got a data plan from AT&T. 5 gigabytes is what she got for $60. She exceeded that plan by 5 gigabytes, and guess what the bill came back? $5,000. It's astonishing to me that the first 5 gigabytes somehow cost $60, and then the second 5 gigabytes costs about as much as a pretty decent used car. So what's going on here? I saw a McKinsey report that was fascinating, which basically said this industry is moving very quickly towards duopoly, or towards a quasi-duopoly. And that concerns us. Basically, in sum, what I would like to say is that if we want competition to work better in this market, and I believe it can, is this market more competitive than some of the other rather monopolistic sectors of telecom? Well, yes, but that's sort of like saying a horse and buggy is a much better way to get around than a unicycle. We can do better than that. So if we want competition, we need to reduce switching costs for consumers. That includes things like number portability, allowing consumers to take their phone numbers with them. We initially, when we first started talking about this 4 years ago, the cell phone industry said this is going to cost billions of dollars and nobody wants it and nobody will use it. Well, that wasn't the truth. The truth was people use this every day. They've been very happy with it, and it not only didn't cost so much, but it has actually allowed some carriers to really win in the marketplace. So the FCC is considering a proposal to reduce the interval from 4 days to 1. We obviously support that, and we hope that the agency will recognize the arguments of the carriers as relatively transparent protectionism. The other thing, if we want competition, switching costs need to come down, and early termination fees are still a major concern for us. I'll note that we were talking about a national model, but we do have a national model in the Uniform Commercial Code, which is the law in 50 states. And what that says is that if you want to charge subscribers for actual damages, that's okay. But if you're charging them a penalty that's designed to prevent them from switching, that's illegal, right? The law of contract says you can't do that because we want competition to work as vigorously as possible. So now the cell phone companies are up here saying, we want a national model exempt us from the law of contracts in 50 states. I hope that the Congress will not go for that opportunity. As we look at a national model, we have to look at what's the price of preemption. If we think that we can put in very strong national consumer standards, it's not totally anathema to consumers, but I do worry when I hear members of Congress saying, discussing how little this industry needs oversight, and then in the next breath talking about a national consumer protection model. That seems to me to be code for we're going to eliminate some strong consumer protections in states. The last thing I want to briefly touch on, I apologize I don't have time to talk about roaming and data roaming and special access, but I'm very concerned about anti-competitive behavior I see in the industry, and I really would beg this committee for more oversight. Recently, we saw AT&T saying they would not allow Skype to be used by users on the 3G radio. They'll allow you to use it on Wi-Fi, but you can't use it on the 3G radio. And the top public policy executive for AT&T says, we absolutely expect our vendors not to facilitate the services of our competitors. This is the internet. It's supposed to be different. This is what's supposed to bring us competition. And if what we're saying is we're just going to treat all these internet companies as competitors and we're not going to let them use our internet connections, well, we have fundamentally broken the internet. So I'm not stepping up today saying regulate the internet. What I'm saying is let's get some oversight. When we have clear examples of anti-competitive behavior, we need action. The last thing I'll say is on access to consumer devices, handset exclusivities, I'll note that Ranking Member Barton has a bill which aims to eliminate exclusives for automotive diagnostic software in an industry which is arguably more competitive than this one. And I think that that's good because you're breaking the stranglehold of automotive dealers and allowing smaller repair shops to get in on a game that would otherwise be a complete monopoly for the dealerships. Well, similarly here, we have some carriers who are absolutely too small to have the market power to get the devices that consumers are demanding. And if we want 3G to be built out in rural areas, I'm telling you, we have to look at this problem. So I thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I hope that we can engage in further oversight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Murray. Dr. Ford.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Stearns, and members of the subcommittee, good morning, and thank you for the invitation. My name is Dr. George Ford. I'm the Chief Economist of the Phoenix Center, a nonprofit 501c3 organization that focuses on the publishing of academic quality research on the law and economics of telecommunications and high-tech industries. Our research is consistently targeted at providing policymakers information about the important role that pro-entry policies must play in the communications industry. Our substantial research production has been published in academic journals, and several of our papers cover many of the topics discussed in this hearing today. The Phoenix Center makes it a policy not to endorse or support any particular piece of federal or state legislation or proposed regulation. Our mission is not to tell policymakers what to think, but more how to think about it. By most accounts, the wireless industry today is workably competitive. The statistics have been cited here today by many members of the subcommittee and many of the panelists. But it is not perfectly competitive. No industry is. Workably competitive means that competitiveness is effective enough at sustaining good performance, even if not matching the textbook concept of perfect competition. Regulation is unlikely to improve market performance in a workably competitive market. Nor is the industry static, but it is constantly changing. The dynamic nature of the industry requires constant reformulation and testing of pricing plans, product offerings, and network capabilities. Some changes are successful, some not. That's the nature of the business. You mentioned earlier, Mr. Chairman, that most Americans have access to 4 or so wireless carriers, and some feel that this makes it a concentrated market, and by some definitions it would. But the relatively concentrated nature of wireless communications is natural and to be expected, given the large amounts of capital expenditures required to participate in the industry. The industry incurs about $20 billion in capital expenditures annually. Economics teaches us that in industries with such large capital costs relative to retail expenditures, only a relatively few number of firms will be able to survive and continue to offer service. The industry structure is, for the most part, preordained by its cost and demand structure. While it is often assumed that observing that there are only a few firms implies that there is little competition, there is no unambiguous theoretical support for this position. Duopoly is not a dirty word. In the 1992 Cable Act, rate regulation was abandoned with the presence of 1.5 firms, and that was in the statute. Okay, that's an HHI of 8,600, according to the rules. I do not mean to imply that industry concentration is irrelevant, but it must be placed in the correct context. Recognizing that the industry is driven by its underlying cost and demand conditions is vital for good policymaking. Let me give you a few examples. Take spectrum caps. Contrary to widely held beliefs, it is not possible to increase the sustainable number of firms in the wireless industry by increasing the amount of spectrum. Whether there are 2 or 10 firms, the cost to deploy and upgrade a wireless network is roughly the same. Dividing the market into smaller pieces by divvying up spectrum into smaller pieces will not increase the number of carriers that can survive. What it will do is cause a non-sustainable industry structure and inevitably result in mergers, bankruptcies, or both. On the other hand, in a world of limited spectrum, having a few firms may actually be a very good thing for society. The more spectrum a firm has, the higher bandwidth services it can offer. If we cut the spectrum into little pieces to make more firms, we might get a little more price competition for low bandwidth services, but we lose the enormous value offered by higher bandwidth innovative services like mobile broadband. There's a trade-off between lots of guys with a little and a few guys with a lot. My research has also shown that given the relatively concentrated nature of telecommunications markets, regulators must be very careful not to exacerbate the factors that generate that outcome. However well-intentioned, regulatory-driven open access or wireless card-phone proposals do exactly that. They both are likely to spark further industry concentration and increase prices for mobile handsets without necessarily benefiting consumers. There could be some benefits to such proposals, but all regulation comes at a cost, and my research leads me to believe that the costs are likely to outweigh the benefits. In a recent paper using auction results show that Carterphone-style open access obligations could reduce industry profitability by 32% and reduce industry investment by $50 billion over the next 10 years. This large reduction in profitability could literally mean the difference between the survival or demise of weaker wireless providers. Open access regulations would, in fact, reduce the number of carriers in the industry and possibly result in significantly less competition and choice for consumers. Moreover, regulations that control handset equipment, a common feature of wireless card phone policies, invariably leads to higher handset prices, but not necessarily lower service prices. And many of the people who propose these rules recognize this outcome, but ignore its implications. This would not be good for the average American, not the high user American, but the average American, and would be particularly harmful with those with low incomes who are prolific users of mobile technology and are more likely to be cord cutters. Another feature of the wireless industry that's typically forgotten, is that for me?
No, that's
policy
for us.
debates, is that it is a multi-product industry.
You are getting near the end
okay.
of your time.
All right, I'll
so
finish up.
forward.
The typical wireless carrier offers local calling, national calling, international calling, email, text messaging, picture messaging. They'll even fix your flat tire. The economic implications of this are important. A wireless firm doesn't offer a price and a service. It offers a set of prices and a set of services. All these services are interrelated. The price of one goes up, the price of the other goes down. The quantity of one goes up, the price of the other ones may change. You cannot take one thing, text messaging or phones, and focus on that one thing and say, oh, there's market power in this market. Because a high price in one service may sustain a low price in the other service. We're not in here talking about restaurants who mark up wine 3 or 4 times and give you water and bread, okay? But it's the same kind of argument that people are making. Finally,
Dr.
we have
Ford,
a paper
you're
here.
about 2 minutes beyond
Okay,
your time.
all right. We have a paper here that we recently published on the national framework for wireless regulation. What's a little different about our approach is that we allowed the state regulator to make efficient decisions for its people. It is acting in the interest of its people. It is not acting incompetently or anything like that. But even still, it makes sense if those decisions in one state spill over into another, whether it be cost or prices, that the regulation move up to the national level. So it's not a debate about the competence of regulation. It's a debate about how the industry and how a particular regulation in one location could impact another.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ford.
Thank you for your time.
And we now have a recorded vote pending on the House floor. I'm going to ask my questions, and then we'll declare a brief recess, and we'll ask our witnesses to stay with us pending the return of members. It shouldn't take very long. We just have one recorded vote to respond to. Let me ask any of the witnesses who want to respond, because several of you mentioned this during the course of your testimony. Several of you have talked about your reliance on the major carriers, Verizon and AT&T, for the special access lines that connect facilities, and you depend upon those lines to connect your facilities. And you've talked about various ways that that problem might be addressed. One possible way to address it is to apply for stimulus funds under the Economic Recovery Act. And there is language in that act that specifically makes middle mile services eligible as a target for grant making under the law. So my question to those who have that concern is, are you planning to apply for stimulus funding for these middle mile links? Mr. Schieber, let's begin with you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sprint's position is, we are closely monitoring that legislation as the terms that are in that legislation are defined, and if depending on how those terms are defined, unserved, underserved, rural, backhaul, et cetera, we may very well apply for those funds. It's unclear at this point until there's more clarification.
Well, let's assume that the criteria make it possible for you to apply, and should you be awarded the grants, would enable those grants to be useful in addressing your middle mile needs. Would you then apply?
We may very well. Again, I will tell you that our friends from FiberTower on the panel here, are the experts in providing wireless backhaul services. And in all honesty, we may look to someone like FiberTower.
All right. Well, let's ask Mr. Potharlanka that same question.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Mr. Chairman. Special access or middle mile, as we've called it, in terms of creating alternatives there, we have to build other types of facilities-based networks. We cannot resell this stuff. You have to actually invest capital to actually build networks so that various end-user networks actually have options, much like we've talked about options. And
well, but Mr. Potharlanka, would you rely to some extent, if it's available, on stimulus funds in order to help you make that investment?
Absolutely. Our technology and what we do is very well suited to actually building these types of networks, and we fully expect that, depending on the rules, we would actually apply.
Okay, that's good. One of the subjects that interests me is possible barriers that might exist to the siting of additional transmitters by carriers on structures that are already in existence to which transmitters are already attached. And within the general category of tower siting, where I understand there are a number of tensions between the local governments that have decision-making authority with regard to this and the carriers that want to site towers, it strikes me that that is one discrete area in which, if it truly is a problem, we might be able to offer some ready solutions. And so let me just ask the question. Where you've got a circumstance where there is an effort and an application to attach an additional transmitter to a tower to which other transmitters are already attached, is there resistance on the part of local governments today to rapidly processing those applications? Are you experiencing that problem? Mr. Potharlanka or others?
Sure. I mean, we certainly experience, zoning or permitting delays and costs associated.
That specific example, if you could answer that, please.
With a specific example?
Yes, that specific example.
Sure. I mean, we have several instances in, the northeastern states where our applications do take a long time.
This is an example, and let me state it again, where a tower already exists, transmitters are already attached to that tower. The application is to attach an additional transmitter to that tower, already containing other transmitters. In that instance, do you know instances where delays are being experienced and those applications are not being rapidly processed?
Absolutely. We attach transmitters to existing sites, existing towers. We don't install new towers. And so that's exactly what we face.
All right. Do others have examples, Mr. Schieber?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we experience the same thing at Sprint, that whether it's a new site or an existing site, there are often delays in getting zoning approvals from the local authorities.
What's the appropriate remedy for that in your mind? And please turn your mic on.
Sorry, I apologize. From our perspective, I think something like a shot clock that encourages the local zoning authorities to make a decision quickly and not stretch the time frame out over many, many years, which is what we experience sometimes, would be very helpful.
All right. I have some additional questions, but I'm going to interrupt those so that we can respond to our recorded vote on the floor. And this subcommittee will stand in recess. I would encourage members to come back as quickly as they voted so we can continue our questioning. And we'll ask for the patience of our witnesses until we return.